These are winter stories from the far north, from Iceland and Norway 1,000 years ago, when a farm under snow was one small ring of lamplight, with the long dark all around it. And when the fire had burned down to a steady glow, and the wool was in everyone's hands, somebody would begin to tell. They are quiet stories, because the people in them lived quietly and kept their nerve, and though some of what they told is strange, and none of it was ever fully explained, all of it is long over, and the families who first told these stories got old telling them, which is how the stories come to be here at all. So settle in where it is warm. You are welcome to sleep whenever sleep finds you, because the stories will not mind, and they will still be here another night. We begin in the north of Iceland, in a broad valley called Vatsdal, in the winter of 974, on a farm called Bakki, with a farmer named Thorgils, his wife Asdís. Their sheep folded warm against the house wall, and a single line of bare footprints in the new snow, which went clear around the farm in the night, and never once came near the door. The story belongs to Vatsdal, a broad, grass-floored valley in the north of Iceland, where a slow river wanders between the hills in long loops, and the people of that valley told it at their winter fires for as long as there were winter fires to tell it at. It concerns a farm called Bakki, which stood on a low rise near the western side of the valley, above the wet meadows and below the scree, and it concerns the family that held Bakki in the winter of 974, which the old people of that district remembered ever after as the hard winter, because the snow came before the slaughter month was out, when the herds are culled down to what the hay can carry, and lay unbroken until the eve of summer. The farmer at Bakki was Thorgils, who had the land after his father, and his wife was Asdís, who had come up from a farm at the valley mouth when they married, and under their roof that winter lived their 3 children. A workwoman named Stay Noon, and an old shepherd called Grim, who had served at Bakki since the days of Thorgils' grandfather, and who alone in that house had lived through a winter of the kind that was coming. The house was built, as all the houses of that country were built then, with walls of turf and stone, the length of a man's arm through, a timber frame inside them, and one long room where the fire burned in a trench down the middle, and the household slept on benches along both walls. The byres stood against the north wall and shared it, so the warmth and breath of the cattle came through the turf to the sleeping benches. And the sheep were folded close against the south wall of the house in a turf-walled fold, near enough that on still nights the family could hear them shifting and settling on the other side of the wall. Above the fire, the roof ridge carried a smoke hole, the one eye of the house, and when winter buried the walls to the eaves, that hole was where the house breathed, and where the little daylight came down to lie on the floor. Thorgils had counted his hay twice before the frost, once from good habit, and once because the summer had been short and wet, and the count said the winter could be managed, and that sum, hay against cold, was the whole of a farmer's thinking from the slaughter month to spring. The snow that stayed came early and came at night, without wind at first, and then with a wind behind it that worked at the roof until morning, and when it had passed, the valley was one white floor from river to scree, gone quiet under the new snow, when every sound is either close and small or does not exist at all. Thorgils went out at mid-morning, when the late dawn finally came, to water the cattle and look at the sky, and he was part way to the byre door when he stopped, because the home field was written on. A single line of footprints came around the shoulder of the rise, crossed the white ground beyond the wall, and went on out of sight behind the byre gable, and the line was too even to be a straying beast, and too single to be men. He walked out to the wall and along it, following the line first with his eyes and then with his feet, and the line went clear around. It passed the byre and kept its distance from the byre, and it passed the sheepfold and kept its distance from the fold. And it went behind the haystack wall and down along the lower field and back up the far side to where it had begun. One closed ring around everything at Bakki that was warm, drawn in the night while the household slept. The prints were a man's in size, or a little larger, evenly spaced and unhurried, pressed deep into the new snow, and they were bare. There was no mark of shoe leather or of wound cloth, only the plain print of a bare foot, heel and toes, over and over, in cold that would take the feeling out of a shod man's toes before he had crossed the yard. Thorgils walked the whole ring once, and then he walked it again, the other direction, and the second walking told him what the first had only suggested, which was that there was no line of prints leading into the circle from anywhere, and no line of prints leading away from it, and that the ring simply began where it began. He stood a while at the place where his own boot prints met the ring, and the valley was silent, except for two ravens going over high up, trading their dry talk between them. And then he went in and watered the cattle, and said nothing that day. Snow fell again 2 nights later, soft and steady, filling the old riding, and in the morning the ring was there again, new and deep and unhurried, the same wide circle at the same distance. And this time, Ostis was at the byre door beside him when the late light showed it, because she had wondered what her husband kept looking at, and had come out to see. They spoke of it inside, quietly, at the fire, in the flat and practical voice that married people keep for things that will not be improved by a loud one. And then they brought Grim out and showed him. The old shepherd went a long stretch of the ring with his hands behind his back, bending over the prints, and what he looked at longest was not the prints, but the distance between ring and wall, which never narrowed and never widened. When he came back, he said that his grandmother had seen the same ring at Bakki in her own day, in another hard winter, long before there was law or church in that valley, and that it had walked the whole of that winter and had kept its distance, the whole of that winter, and that the right thing to do about it was the thing they were already doing, which was nothing, done carefully. The farm kept a dog, a gray, sensible bitch who had walked the sheep with Grim for 9 autumns, and from the first night of the ring she would not cross the home field wall after dusk. She did not whine, and she did not bark, because whatever her reasons were, noise was not among them. She sat in the yard while the light lasted, facing the field with her ears up, and when the light went, she came in and lay against the bench with her eyes open, and that was where she spent every night of that winter. Dees made the only rule that was ever made about it, and she made it at the fire on the 3rd or 4th evening, without raising her eyes from the wool in her hands. The rule was that the thing in the field was not to be spoken of after dark, not because speaking of it would bring it nearer, for nobody knew what would bring it nearer, but because the nights were 5 months long and the children were small, and a house cannot winter well with a wrong thing sitting in the middle of every evening. So the ring belonged to the mornings, a look and a word over it, and no more, and the evenings belonged to the wool and to old stories that had nothing to do with Bakki. And in that fashion the household kept its balance, which in a northern winter is a thing a family keeps or loses whole. Thorgils, for his part, answered it with measurement, because he was a man who trusted his eye, but trusted a marked stick more. He cut a birch wand from the low stand below the field and cut it to the exact distance between the home field wall and the near edge of the prints, and after every new snow he went out and laid the wand between the wall and the ring at a dozen places around the circle. All through the first half of that winter, the wand fit, snow after snow, to the breadth of a finger. Whatever walked at Bakki in the dark, walked a chosen line and held it. And the holding was worse than a wandering would have been, because a wandering is an animal, and a held line is a decision. Yule came with a spell of still, deep cold, the stars thick from mid-afternoon on, and the fire kept longer and brighter for the season. And it was at Yule that Grim did the one thing anyone in that house ever did toward the ring. He took a bowl of the good broth from the Yule pot, carried it out through the blue dusk, and set it on the flat top of the fence stone at the gate of the home field. And he did not say who had taught him to do it, and nobody asked him. In the morning, the bowl was empty and clean. A fox will empty a bowl left out in that country, and a wind will tip one over, and nobody at Bakki ever stood at the door in the dark to learn which of them it had been, because there are things it is better to do than to watch being answered. It was a few mornings after Yule that the ring changed, the only time it ever changed. Stay Noon saw it first, going out to the fold in the half-dark, and she came back in and spoke quietly to Thorgils, and he went out with the wand. Opposite the door of the house, out beyond the wall where the ring passed nearest, there were two prints side by side, facing the house, pressed deeper than the walking prints were pressed, and the snow in them had been packed to ice by long standing. The walking line came into those two prints and went out of them again and carried on around the circle at its even, unhurried spacing. So at some hour of that night, the thing had stopped there. In front of the door, and the door's thin seam of firelight, and had stood a long while facing the household asleep, and then had taken up its round again. Thorgils laid the wand down between the wall and the standing prints, and the wand fit. Even standing, even facing them, it had kept the distance exact, and he told Dees afterward that this was the morning he stopped being afraid it would come nearer, and began instead to wonder, with a cold and even sort of wondering that stayed with him the rest of his life, why it did not. That is the part of the story the valley kept sharpest, and the tellers of it always said the same two things, in the same order. The prints were bare feet, always bare, in cold that split stones up on the ridge. And there was never in all that winter a line of prints leading into the circle, or a line of prints leading away from it. The rest of that winter has no events in it, and the tellers always made a point of that too, because the wrongness of that winter was never in anything happening, but in the manner of nothing happening, night after night, at an even pace, just beyond the wall. The evenings inside went on in their long order. Astis's weaving growing on the loom against the gable, wool moving through Steinun's fingers by the fire. The children asleep early in the dark end of the room, the roof timbers creaking now and then as the snow settled its weight over them, the sheep breathing and shifting on the far side of the turf. And on the still nights, with the fire banked and the household banked down around it, every grown person in that room knew, without anyone saying it, that the yard beyond the wall was being written on again, slowly and evenly, by something with bare feet and all the patience in the world. Deep winter passed in storms that filled the ring, and still nights that renewed it, and the household came through in the plain, hard order of that country, feeding out the hay by count and digging the drifted door clear after the big blows. Grim watched the hay and said the count would hold, and it held. The ring came and went with the snows, always at its distance, and there were no more standing prints, and by the time the light began to come back, a little more of it every noon, the family had learned to live at the middle of that circle, knowing it was there and not looking at it more than the work required. The thaw came late, but came all at once, in a week of south wind and running water, and the valley went from white to brown, and the writing in the yard went with the snow. The last morning there was any ring to see. It lay half sunk in melt, softened out of all its sharpness, and by the morning after, there was only wet grass and mud, and the yard held nothing but the household's own comings and goings. That spring, farms up and down. Vatsdal counted what the hard winter had cost them, and some had lost sheep to the cold, and some to the wet that followed. And Bakki, which had wintered inside a ring nobody could explain, lost not one animal, and not one person under its roof had been sick a day. The old people of the valley were quiet about that, and their quiet had a shape to it, and the shape was this: a thing that circles a farm all winter and takes nothing, is not nothing. And what it was doing out there in the dark, night after night at its even distance, may have been something other than wanting in. The ring came again in other winters, some winters and not others, with years between and no pattern anyone ever found. And it was always the same ring, bare feet, even spacing, the exact old distance, and it never once, in any winter, came nearer than the wand. The family got old telling it, and the customs outlived the tellings, because at Bakki, for as long as that family held but land, nobody swept the first snow from the yard until the sun had been on it, and every Yule a bowl of the good broth went out through the dusk to the fence stone and was empty by morning. And the door of Bakki was never once knocked at, in all those winters, by anything that left bare prints in the snow. The circle kept its distance, and the house kept its fire, and between the two of them, the winter always ended. That was the account from Bakki, in the valley of Vatsdal, where the first snow of the winter carried one line of bare footprints around the whole farm, beyond the home field wall, with no track leading toward that circle, and no track leading away. Thor, Gills measured the distance with a birch wand after each new fall. Old Grim remembered that the same boundary had been kept in his grandmother's time, and the household tended its animals and its fire without stepping out to challenge what had chosen to remain beyond them. When the thaw came, the footprints went with the snow, although the family remembered the distance and left the first snow of later winters untouched until daylight had rested on it. The next telling comes from Skagafjord in the north of Iceland, where two neighboring farms shared a fence, and where a man who had walked that boundary throughout his life was seen walking it once more after his burial, always on his own side of the stones. Along Skagafjord, a broad firth on the north coast of Iceland, where green valleys run down to gray water between snow-topped ridges, they told a story about two farms and the fence between them, and it was told most often in winter, for reasons the story itself makes plain. The farms were Hof and Grund, neighbors on the eastern side of a valley that opens on the fjord, Hof standing higher, back against the hillside, and Grund below it on the good ground, down toward the river meadows where the hay grows heaviest and the river slides flat and slow to the sea. In the year 998, the farmer at Hof was Thor Vohold, an old man by then and steady, and the farmer at Grund was Onund, of an age with him. And between their two lands ran a fence of turf and stone that the two of them had built with their own hands when they were young. And that fence is what the story is about. Their fathers had quarreled over that boundary, a quarrel of the old kind between neighbors, over the lower river meadow. And it smoldered through 2 generations without ever quite catching. And when the fathers were dead, Onund and Thorvald, both young then and neither wanting to inherit a fire, ended it. They walked the boundary together from the shore stone up to the hill stone, with witnesses gathered from the farms round about, and at each marker stone along it they swore the line in the proper form of the law. And then, so the line would never again live only in memory and oaths, they gave it a body, turf and stone, breast high, from one end of the boundary to the other, 2 summers of work between them. The lower river meadow fell to Hof by that settlement, and there were men in Onund's own household who thought Grund had given away too much and said so. And Onund answered them once and never again, saying that hay grows back every summer and a quarrel grows back every generation, and that he had traded the one for the other and thought it a good trade. Onund walked his fence every day of his life after that. It was his habit at the end of the day's work, in every weather, in the light half of the year and in the dark half, to go down along the line as far as the river and back up along it toward the hill. And he touched the marker stones in passing, every one, with the flat of his hand, out of a habit nobody had taught him. He was easy to know at any distance on that walk, because a green ox had run him against a gate rail when he was young, and the left shoulder had set low, so he went with a small lean to that side. Unhurried, his head a little forward, and 40 years of neighbors had watched that lean go down the fence line at dusk and thought nothing of it, except that the day at Grund was ending in its right order. He died in the autumn of that year, 998, and he died the best death that country offers, which is a quiet one, with the hay in. The haymaking had been good. The stack stood thatched and waited, and one night after the work was done, Onund went to his bench well and did not wake, an old man's death, with nothing in it to trouble anyone beyond the plain grief of it. They buried him in the old style, in a mound raised in his own home field, within sight of his own door, so the farm and the man could keep each other company, and the whole valley came to the burial. Thor, Vald, first among them, and it was noticed and long remembered that the old man of Hof stood a while at the finished mound with his hand laid flat on the turf of it, and said nothing that anybody heard. The ravens went over the valley all that afternoon, trading their dry talk high up, and the weather closed in behind the burial, and winter came down on Skagafjord, early and hard. Grund went to Onund's son, Vind, a capable man of 30 with his father's build and none of his father's lean, and he took up the farm well, and that has to be said of him plainly, because of what the story does next. But he was of the generation that had heard, at the fire, all through boyhood, the old opinion that Grund had given away too much in the settlement, and the lower river meadow lay under that opinion every time he looked at it, which from his own door was daily. More than once that early winter, and to more people than his wife, he said that a fence is only where men agree it is, and that agreements between dead men bind the dead. And that in the spring, he meant to see whether the line might not be looked at again, moved a little, bought outright if it came to that. And the older people who heard him did not argue, because he was young, and the winter would be long. It was Hoff's shepherd who saw it first, a young man called Kalf, out at dusk a few days past midwinter after 2 ewes that had broken from the fold. The dusk comes in the middle of the afternoon at that season, and the light that is left is blue and comes up off the snow more than down from the sky. And in that light, away down by the river meadows, Kalf saw a man walking the fence line. He took him at first for one of the Grundmen out on some errand, and he raised his hand, because a man greets his neighbor in that country, whatever the weather. And the figure did not turn its head, and did not check its pace. It went on along the line, unhurried, bareheaded in the deep cold, with no cloak on it, and its left shoulder rode low, and it went with a small, lean, and, as it passed the hillside marker stone, it touched the top of the stone with the flat of its hand. Kalf stood where he was, until it had gone down the darkening line out of his sight toward the river, and then he found his ewes and drove them home along the upper ground. And that same evening, at the fire at Hof, he told what he had seen in a level voice, to Thorvald directly. The old man listened without setting down his food, and when Kalf had finished, he asked one thing only, which was whether the walker had touched the stones. Kalf said he had touched the one stone that Kalf had seen him pass. Thorvald sat a while with that, and then he said that this was right, and as it should be, and he told the household that from that evening until spring, nobody from Hof was to be out on the river meadows past mid-afternoon. Not from fear, he said, but from courtesy, because a man walking his own line has a right to walk it undisturbed. He never explained further, and he never spoke of it again in open company, and from that night the old man carried something in his manner that was not grief, and was not fear either, and the nearest anyone at Hof ever came to naming it was that he had the look of a man whose oldest friend had kept an appointment. Through the rest of that winter, the figure was seen many times, and always the same, at dusk or under the moon, on the Grun side of the fence, walking the line from the hill stone down to the river and back, touching the stones in passing. Nobody ever saw it arrive, and nobody ever saw it leave off. It was on the line, or it was not. Both households answered it the same quiet way, by leaving the dusk to it, and the work of the 2 farms bent itself around that hour without anyone giving an order, and the winter went on, and the cold deepened until the river froze from bank to bank. And the ice of it could be heard now and then settling, far off, one long, dull note down in the dark, a sound the people of that valley had heard in every deep winter of their lives and paid no mind. What set this account apart from every other tale of a man seen after his burial, and the reason Skagafjord kept it, was the snow, because the snow takes down everything that touches it, and this is what the snow said. After a still night when the figure had been out, there would be prints along the Grun side of the fence, a man's prints of a man's weight, and the left print of every pair was set a little heavier than the right. The line of them began at the mound in the home field, and it ended at the mound in the home field, and in all that winter it never once left the line of the fence, not by so much as a stride, and it never once crossed it. He had walked out of his own field, along his own boundary, and back to his own place, and he had kept, in every print of that round, to his own side. Vind heard all of this, because everyone heard all of it, and he said little, and what became of his plans that winter he never told in full, But this much came down from his own household about one evening late in the season. He was standing at his own door at dusk, in sight of his father's mound, and the figure came up from the river along the fence at its even pace, and at the big gray marker stone partway up the line, the stone where the oath had been sworn when the fence was made, it stopped. It stood at that stone with its hand laid flat on the top of it, and it stayed so, while the last of the light went, not turning and not moving. A dark, upright shape against the blue snow with its hand on the sworn stone. And Vind stood at his door and watched it stand there, and neither of them moved for a long time. Then darkness covered the valley, and when the moon cleared the ridge, the line was empty, and Eyvind went in and shut the door softly and sat at the fire a long while. And his wife, seeing his face, kept the children to the far end of the room and let him alone. The thaw came, and the ice went out of the river loudly over some days. And after the snow was gone, the figure was not seen, because whatever walked the line walked it in winter, and winter was over. Eyvind rode to the spring assembly with the other men of the district, and the neighbors who remembered his winter talk waited for the boundary to be raised, and he did not raise it, not that spring, and not any spring after. What he did instead was done at home, and quietly in the autumn after the haymaking, and it became the custom of both farms for as long as those families held that ground. The farmer of Grund and the farmer of Hof walked the fence together. From the shore stone to the hill stone, side by side on their own sides of it, and at each marker stone they laid their hands flat on the top of it, and they swore nothing, because the oath was already sworn and standing. Neither family in later years would say when that custom began, or whose thought it had first been, only that it was old and that it was kept. The figure was seen in other winters, and then in fewer, always at dusk, always at a distance, always on the line, and the seeing of it passed slowly from an event into a weather, a thing a shepherd might mention when he came in and be answered with a nod. The fence itself outlasted everyone in this story, because 2 farms kept it, and neither would let a rod of it slump, and travelers along Skaga Fjord were shown it generations on, standing straight and breast high with the snow lying quiet along the top of it. And they were told that the lower river meadow belonged to Hof, and that nobody at Grund grudged it, and that the man who had traded that meadow for 100 years of peace lay in the mound in his own home field, within sight of his own door, where his fence was the first thing the light found every morning. And in the deep of winter, at dusk, the people of both farms kept off the river meadows, not from fear, and left the line to the one who kept it best. That was the story of Hof and Grund, and of Onund, who built the fence between those farms with Thorvald, and kept it carefully for as long as he lived. After Onund died, the evening snow showed a path from his mound to the boundary stones and back again, while the figure seen at dusk never crossed onto the neighboring land. His son, Eyvind, abandoned his plan to move the fence, and the 2 households returned each autumn to walk the line together, placing their hands on the stones that had outlasted the men who first set them. From that quiet boundary we travel east to Norway, to a hill farm above the Otra River in Setesdal, where deep snow could seal a household indoors, and where, on the first sealed night of winter, an even count of knocks came down through the smoke hole. far south in Norway, a long day's travel up from the coast, there is a narrow valley called Teisdal, where the river Otra comes down the valley floor from the high fells in a chain of pools and rapids, and the farms sit on the valley sides wherever the ground offers them a shelf to sit on. High on the eastern side, above the river, at the top of its own steep cleared ground with the pine forest standing close behind it, there was a farm called Hoen, a name that means the hill. And this story is Hoen's story. It was told the length of Teisdal for many generations, by people who would name the farm readily enough, and then, when they were pressed for the rest of it, would look into the fire for a while before going on. In the winter of 1014, the farmer at Hoen was Tormod, and with him under the roof lived his wife Ragnhild, his old mother Gyda, and their 4 children. 7 souls in the house together, with the beasts through the wall in the byre. And that number, 7, matters to this story, so it is worth saying twice. Winter on the high farms of that valley was a burial, and the people made ready for it calmly and thoroughly, because they had never known anything else. The firewood came in before the snow and was stacked inside, along the entry and under the benches, since nobody wants to be digging for wood in the dark of the year. And the hay filled the loft over the byre, and the dried fish and the barrels stood in the store, and the loom stood strung by the gable for the winter's weaving. When the great snows came, sometimes before Yule and sometimes after, they came until the walls were buried and the door was sealed shut behind drift. And the house went dark and warm and small and breathed through the smoke hole in the ridge. And there would be weeks at a stretch when that hole was the only proof the valley had that Hoen was still alive. In the milder spells, sleet came instead of snow and rattled soft on the turf of the roof for days together, and the family below heard every weather from the firelight and told them apart by ear without thinking about it. The knocking belonged to Hoen. It was old and it was reliable, and nobody living had been consulted about it. Gyda had heard it in every deep winter of her life, and her mother had heard it before her. And her mother's mother had heard it on that farm before anyone in the valley had so much as heard of the White Christ, and what all of them knew about it, no more and no less, was this: it never came while the door could open. All the first part of every winter, while the yard could still be crossed and a neighbor could still be reached on skis down the valley side, the roof at night carried nothing but weather, wind, and the settling of snow, and the slow creak of the timbers taking the weight. But on the first night after the drifts had sealed the door, the first night the household was truly shut in, it came, and after that it came now and again through all the sealed weeks. On no night anyone could predict, and at no hour anyone could name in advance, except that the fire was always banked and the house was always still when it began. It came from the roof ridge up by the smoke hole, and it was soft, a blunt, small sound, wood against wood, a knuckle's weight and no more, unhurried, with the spaces between the knocks even, and the whole of it together was quieter than the fire. There was nothing in it of demand. A knocking at a door asks to come in, and every other knocking any of them ever heard in their lives carried some wanting in it, and this one carried none, and that was the first thing that set it apart. The second thing was the count, because it knocked a fixed number of times and then stopped, and the number was the same on every night of a winter, and the number was 7, and there were 7 people under the roof. Gyda, said the count, had been 6 in her girlhood, when the house had held 6 and 9 in her mother's day. in the crowded years when two uncles wintered at Holt with their wives. And she said the count had changed whenever the house changed, always without a winter's delay, and that no one had ever taught it the number, and no one had ever been able to say how it knew. Nobody at Holt had ever seen anything on the roof, and there was no way anyone could have, because the door was under the drift and the smoke hole showed only its own small square of dark. And whenever the weather cleared enough for the men to climb the packed drift and sight along the roofline, the snow up there lay unbroken in the morning light, unbroken always, without a print in it of bird or beast. The rules that went with it were Gida's, inherited along with the knocking, and she kept the household to them without ever once raising her voice. Nobody answered it, and nobody called out while it knocked or spoke at all until it was done, and nobody looked up at the smoke hole while the sound lasted, and above everything else, nobody counted aloud along with it, because the count was its business, and not the household's. And a house does well to let what happens on the roof stay on the roof. So when it came, the work in the room simply went on a little more quietly, the spindle turning in Gida's fingers, Ronhild keeping her place by the fire. The children lying still on the benches with their eyes open, while the knocks fell soft and even up in the dark, 1 to 7, and stopped. And when they had stopped, Ronhild would lay a fresh stick of birch on the fire, because Gida's mother had always done that after, and Gida had always done that after. And nobody any longer knew what the fresh stick answered, only that it had always been the next thing done, and that the winters at Holt had always ended well. The winter this story rides on sealed the valley early. The snow came heavy before Yule and did not let up for the turning of the year. And Holt went under. The door drifted to the eaves and the smoke hole breathing its one thread of smoke up into the gray. And somewhere in the middle of the sealed weeks, with no midwife to be had and none needed, because Gida had done that work up and down the valley for 40 years, Ronhild was brought to bed and bore a daughter. It went well. The child was sound and warm and had a good voice, and they wrapped her and laid her between her mother and the fire. And Tormod sat up that night with the lamp trimmed low and looked at his daughter a long time, while the beasts shifted and breathed through the wall, and the house was as warm and as glad as a buried house in the dark of the year can be, which is warmer and gladder than most people now would guess. No one had left the house, because no one could. No word had gone down the valley, because there was no way down the valley, and would be none until the weather broke. And the nearest neighbor was half a day off in good snow, and out of all reach in that snow, so there was no person in the world outside that one buried room who knew the child existed. Then, some nights after the birth, in the still hour with the fire banked, the knocking came again, soft, and even at the ridge, and the household lay and sat in its places and let it come. And Gida's spindle kept turning, and the knocks fell one after another with their even spaces between them, and they came to 7 and did not stop. They came one more, the same soft weight, the same unhurried spacing, 8, and then the roof was quiet. The fire fluttered low, and Ronhild, they said afterward, drew the sleeping child in against her under the blanket, slowly, and nobody spoke at all until she had reached out with her free hand and laid the fresh birch stick on the fire. Tormod said, years on, when the children were grown and telling the story themselves, that he lay awake a long while that night, not in fright, because the knocking had been the sound of his winters since he was a boy on those same benches, but working at a sum he could not put down. The door had been sealed for weeks, and the snow on the roof lay unbroken, and no living thing had come up the valley side or could have, and yet the Count was right. And the Count being right meant that whatever kept it had known, on the night itself or before it, that the house held one more, and had amended its number quietly and gone on. Whatever was on the other side of the turf knew how end to a soul. In the middle of winter, under the snow, and the house knew nothing of it in return, and never would. And that unevenness, he said, was what he turned over and over until the fire was gray. Gyda, when her son said some of this aloud in the spring, gave him the only other piece of it she ever gave anyone. Her grandmother had told of a farm far down the valley, in the old days, whose name Gyda would not say, where the household heard a knocking of this same kind in the sealed weeks. And where one winter, with every soul under that roof hail and the hay holding and nothing wrong that anyone could point to, the Count came one fewer. That was all of it she would tell. Pressed for what followed, she looked into the fire and was quiet, and the quiet went on so long that nobody pressed again. And the one thing she added, later that evening, and to nobody in particular, was that the family of that farm had flitted to the coast before the next winter, and that the toffs of it, the bare house places, stood in birch scrub still, and that at Howen, in all the generations the knocking had come, the Count had never once been wrong. A right count, she said, was a thing to be glad of, and then the spindle went on turning, and that was the end of what anyone ever learned from Gyda. The weather broke in its usual weeks, and the men dug the door out into a blue morning, and the valley came slowly back into reach, and the knocking ended with the sealed snow, because it always did, from the first day the door could open. The roof at night carried nothing but weather again, and by the time the Otra ran loud with melt, the winter's counting was a story the children were telling down the valley at the spring gatherings, where it joined all the other winter's tellings of it. The daughter born under the snow grew up at Howen and heard the knocking in every deep winter of her girlhood, 7, and then, in the winter after her grandmother died, an old woman full of years with her wool at her feet, 6, because the roof kept an honest ledger, and there was a comfort in that of a cold and steady kind. The custom stayed with the farm for as long as the old telling can follow it. On the first night of every winter that the snow sealed the door, the household of Howen gathered on the benches, with the lamp trimmed and the fire fed, and they let the house be counted, and did not answer. And when the last knock had gone, they laid the birch on the fire and went on with their evening, because the Count was right, and the winter would end, and those two things had never yet failed to arrive together. The knocking never came while the door could open, and it never came wrong, and those two plain facts were the whole of the comfort the family had, and the family found them, winter after winter, to be enough. That was the Count at Howen, where the knocking began only after snow closed the door, and always matched the number of people beneath the roof. No word had left the farm when Hild gave birth during the winter of 1014, yet the next count included the newborn child. And old Gyda accepted that extra knock with the gratitude of someone who remembered another farm where the number had once come wrong. How? And kept the custom after that winter, sitting quietly beneath the smoke hole until the count was finished and waiting for the thaw to open the door again. Our next story returns to Iceland, to Holt, beneath the Eyjafjallajökull mountains, where one hearth fire had been carried from the first settlement years and had never been permitted to die, because the household knew what waited above it when only one coal remained. The story I have for you now belongs to a farm called Holt, which stands under the Eyjafjall Mountains on the south coast of Iceland. Where the hay fields run down toward black sand and the sea, and the ice on the high shoulders of the mountain shows white above the home field all through the year. It is a story about a fire, because the fire in the long hearth at Holt was never once let out, not in 140 years of winters, and the people of that house knew the reason and told it only under their own roof. It came down along the south coast all the same, from a daughter of that house to her daughters, until it reached the telling you are hearing now. In the first years of the settlement, when the ships were still coming in from Norway and the land had no names on it yet, a man called Thor Ulf came ashore on that coast with his household and his beasts, and he claimed his ground in the manner of that time, which was to carry fire around it. That was law and custom together in the empty country, because a settler walked out his boundary carrying burning brands from first light, and what he could ring round with fire in one day was his. Thorolf walked his ring on a still autumn day, and the men who walked it with him remembered one thing about that walk for the rest of their lives, and told their children. Along one stretch of the boundary, up under the black slopes where the mountain comes down in old broken rock, the flame he carried lay over flat, though there was no wind at all, and it stood upright again, once that stretch was behind them. Thorolf said nothing about it then, and he set his hall a good way down the slope from that place, with its door toward the sea. When the hall was built, turf and stone over a timber frame, with the long fire down the middle and the sleeping benches along both walls, Thorolf lit that fire from the fire he had carried around the land, and not from any new striking. From that first evening onward, the fire at Holt was the same fire. It was banked in ash every night and blown back to life every morning, and it went on so through Thorolf's life and long past it. One fire, older than anyone living, older than the roof over it. The keeping of it was the housewife's charge, handed woman to woman, and the words of it never changed. The fire at Holt is never let out, never lent away whole, and never struck new. A neighbor short of fire was welcome to carry coals from Holt in an iron pot, so long as the mother fire stayed on the hearth. And every bride who married into the house, and every hand who wintered there, was told the charge plainly on the first evening, with no story attached, because the story was for family, and the rule worked just as well without it. Now that coast under the mountains had its winter matters, and every settled place in the country carried some private rule through the dark season. There was a farm up the river, where nobody crossed the yard after the lamps were lit in the depth of winter, and a shore farm to the west, where prints came up out of the tide line some years, and such things were managed quietly, with custom and a banked fire. But Holt had none of it. Nothing crossed Holt's home field in the dark, and in 140 years no beast there was found dead without a plain reason. The old people of the district used to say that the land at Holt had been bargained for fairly and was being paid for nightly, and when they said it, nobody laughed. The night the fire nearly died came in the third generation, in the winter the district afterward called the wet winter, when storm followed storm off the sea from before Yule, the midwinter feast, until long after it. For 3 days at the worst of it, the wind stood in the southeast and drove sleet against the mountain, and the household of Holt was out in every hour of daylight, digging sheep from the drifts along the fences and carrying them in over their shoulders to the byre, which shared its long wall with the hall, so that the warmth of the beasts was part of the warmth of the house. By the third evening, every back at Holt ached, and every coat hung soaked from the pegs, and the people ate their dried fish standing up, and went to the benches half asleep. The fire watch that night fell to a girl called Asdiz, 16 that winter, a fosterling of the house who had worked those 3 days as hard as anyone grown. She meant to sit up, and she banked the fire well, and she settled against the bench post with the fire iron across her knees, and the warmth got into her shoulders. And she slept, because there was nothing left in her to stay awake with, and nobody ever blamed her afterward, least of all the old woman the story is about to come to. While she slept, the wind swung into the south, and sleet came down through the smoke hole in small flurries, hissing faintly where it landed, and the long fire went down under it without complaint, coal by coal, until one coal was left alive under the wet ash. What woke Thorgerd, the mother of that household and Thorolf's granddaughter, was not a sound, but the end of one, because somewhere in the small hours the storm had finished, and the quiet that followed 3 days of weather was deep enough to lift her out of sleep. She lay on her bench and listened, and the hall was darker than the hall was ever allowed to be, and the cold had come up through the floor in a manner she had never once felt in that house. And high in the roof ridge, the smoke hole stood open on a sky blown clear, with hard bright stars in it. She watched the stars while she gathered herself, and while she watched, they went out. No cloud crossed them, because she was exact on that point ever afterward, and the little square of sky above the smoke hole simply went dark, and stayed dark, and the darkness did not move. Thorgerd did not wake the house, and she did not look up again. She rose without noise and found the long fire drowned under wet ash, and raked the ash aside with the fire iron until she came to the one live coal, small and going dull at its edges. She took dry birch bark from the box beneath the bench and shavings, and she knelt over the coal and blew on it in long, slow breaths, and between her breaths there was no sound in the hall at all, and she kept her eyes on the coal. She said afterward that keeping her eyes down was the whole labor of that night, harder than the blowing, and that she managed it because the fire needed her, and the smoke hole did not. In time, the bark caught, and the flame stood up along the spine of the old fire, and strengthened, and reached the roof beams with its light, and when it did, the stars were back above the smoke hole, all of them in their usual places. In the morning, the men went up to clear the smoke hole and see what the storm had done to the roof, and the snow lay on the turf, a forearm deep, except around the smoke hole itself. There the snow was gone, and a clean ring the width of a man lying down, and inside the ring the turf was bare and dry, in a frost that had put a crust on everything else in the valley, and the winter grass lay pressed flat, all of it leaning outward from the hole. Beyond the ring the snow was untouched, and there were no marks on the roof and none anywhere in the yard, and the drifts stood against the walls exactly where the storm had built them. So whatever had spent that night at the smoke hole had spent it looking down at one coal, and it had left no sign of arriving and no sign of going. Thorgerd stood on the ladder and looked at the ring for a long while, and came down and said very little then or ever. What she thought she told only once, to a granddaughter who asked her years afterward, and the answer was that all through that night she had understood the fire to need her, and that she had been right. And that was the end of the answer. What she did lasted longer than what she said, because from that winter on, the watch at Holt was kept by two people, turn and turn about. And a lamp burned at either end of the hall besides the long fire, and the instruction to the watch, given in the same words every autumn, was to keep their eyes on the fire and not on the smoke hole. When the new faith came into the country, around the turn of the 1,000 years, a young priest traveled that coast in spring, and at every farm he asked the household to let the old fire die and take new fire, blessed, from the church being raised along the shore. At Holt, they heard him out with courtesy, and fed him well, and gave him a dry bed, and did not do it. The story goes that in the morning, the housewife of that day walked him up onto the roof, and showed him where the ring had been, and told him the whole of it from Thorolf's walk onward. And the priest stood a while, looking up at the black slopes, and then he blessed the house and the fire with it, and rode on, and never asked again. The fire at Holt was still burning when this story was last carried out of the district, and for anything anyone can say, it is burning yet. The house above it was rebuilt more than once, and the fire outlasted all of it, one unbroken thread reaching back to the brands Thorolf carried around the land. And the people of that house would tell you one thing more, the small habit the story always ends on, which is that, on some still winter nights, with the door pegged and no draft moving in the hall, the flames of the long fire lean over all together. Slowly, toward the mountain, toward the stretch of boundary where Thorolf's flame lay down flat on the first day. And when the fire leans, whoever is on watch puts more wood on, and the fire straightens, and the night goes on. Nobody at Holt ever let the fire go hungry while it was asking, and that, as plainly as it was ever handed down, is the reason the fire at Holt is never let out. That was the fire at Holt, burning without a break from the years when Thorolf first marked out the farm. During one storm-worn winter, it dwindled to a single coal under wet ash, and while Thor Gerd worked to save it, a presence remained at the smoke hole until the flame rose again. Morning showed a dry ring in the snow around the roof opening, with no mark of an arrival or departure, so the household doubled the watch and kept 2 lamps ready from then onward. In every later telling, the hearth survived, and when its flames leaned toward the mountain, the family fed them and allowed the winter night to pass. Farther north, across the frozen water of Eyja Fjord, another old sign stood beyond the warmth of the farms, a faint blue light above a settler's mound that brightened before hard weather and once burned brighter for an event that never seemed to arrive. This next one was told on both shores of Eyjafjord, a long, deep fjord in the north of Iceland, with good farmland sloping down to the water on either side. And because it belongs to both shores at once, it never settled into any one family, and everyone along that water tells it a little differently, and nobody tells it wrong. I had it in the shape it was kept at Longhouse, an old and well-run farm on the eastern shore with its hay fields running to the fjord, where it was told, by the long fire on winter nights, by a grandmother of that house named Hild, and her shape of it begins where I will begin, with the mound across the water. On the western shore, opposite Longhouse, and a little to the north, a low headland runs out into the fjord, green in summer and bare in winter, with ravens working over it in most weathers, and on the crown of that headland stands a mound. It was raised in the first generation of the settlement over a man called Helgi, one of the first to take land on that shore, who farmed it through a long life and was laid in the mound within sight of his own hall door, facing the water, in the old manner of burial, with his goods about him. By the winter this story keeps, he had been in the ground 100 years, and the farm he cleared had passed to the 4th generation of his line. And the mound had settled into the headland so gently that it might have passed for a shoulder of the hill, except that everyone on that water knew it was not. On some winter nights, a light stood on that mound. The old people called it mound fire, and it was a small blue burning low to the ground that sat on the crown of the mound without spreading and without consuming anything, and it was not the skylights, which every child in the north grows up under, because the skylights move and ripple far overhead and think nothing of anybody. And this light stood still, close to the ground, in one place, over one man's grave. It gave no smoke and made no sound, and when it was strong it laid a faint blue sheen down the headland grass, and on nights of hard frost, with the fjord frozen from shore to shore, that sheen carried across the ice, and from the yard at Longhouse the light could be seen plainly, a small blue seed burning on the far side of the water. Nobody on either shore made any great matter of it. Children at Longhouse grew up with the light across the water, and guests who came at Yule, the midwinter feast, were walked out to the home field fence to be shown it, and there was a quiet pride in the showing, because not every district can offer 100-year light. People called it Helgi's light, as often as they called it mound fire. And when it burned small and steady on a clear night, the saying along the shore was that the old man was minding his headland, and the farms on both sides slept none the worse for it. But the light had a habit, and the habit was the useful part of it, and the reason the story was kept with such care. On ordinary nights the mound fire was faint, an ember at that distance, coming and going with the frost, and before hard weather it brightened. 2 days ahead of the weather, sometimes 3, and well before the sky gave any sign of its own, the light stood up taller on the mound and burned a stronger blue, and the farms along both shores read it and went to work. Hay was got under cover, boats were hauled far above the tide line, and the sheep were folded in close against the walls. And travelers who had meant to cross the ice or ride the long way round stayed at home instead. And then the weather came, and it was always weather worth the warning. In 100 years of reading it, so the story claims, the light was never once wrong, and it never once brightened for nothing, and the second half of that claim is the half this story turns on. The proof people told oftenest was the winter the ice went out early. The fjord in those years froze hard enough most winters to bear a horse and sledge, and crossing on the ice saved half a day against the shore road, so the crossing was well used and one late winter. With the ice looking as sound as it had ever looked, the light on the mound stood up bright for 2 nights together, and the shore farms took their horses off the ice trails and waited. On the 3rd night, the district heard the fjord begin to open, the long, deep booming of parting ice that travels up through the ground into the house floors and into the benches themselves, going on for hours. Far out in the dark, and in the morning, there was black water down the middle of the fjord where the crossing had been, and every soul on both shores was home beside a banked fire when it went. So the shores trusted the light, and had trusted it through 3 generations, when there came the winter that Ragnhild's telling was really about. The winter of the year 1002, 2 years after the whole country had taken the new faith at the great law meeting in the south. It was a hard, bright winter, and the fjord froze early and froze deep, and at Yule the light on the mound began to brighten. The first night it rose to its storm, warning strength, and the second night it passed that, and it went on brightening, night upon night, until it burned brighter than any living person had seen it, and brighter than the oldest telling spoke of. It laid a blue lane across the ice from the headland to the Loibas shore, and at midnight, from the hall door at Loibas, the fence posts of the home field could be counted by it, and their shadows lay long across the snow, every one of them pointing away from the water. Both shores did what the light had taught them. Hay was counted and roped down. The boats went higher up the shore than the oldest tide line anyone could point to. The buyers were checked at every dusk. And nobody set foot on the ice, and families who had meant to ride to their kin for the feast days stayed where they were and kept the feast small. The new faith was 2 winters old in the country that year, and there were people along the fjord who said the old man in the mound had no business burning so bright in a christened land, and they said it quietly, and not while facing the water. And through all of it, the ice held, and the nights were windless, and the light burned on. And then nothing came. The days after Yule ran mild and still, with high, thin cloud and hardly a breath of wind, and the ice held, and nothing moved on the fjord but ravens crossing between the shores. The light stood at its full, unheard-of brightness for 3 nights, and along both shores the fires were banked with particular care, and the households sat up in turns to watch it, and the only sounds in the halls were the embers settling and the frost working in the timbers. On the 4th evening the light was smaller, and by the 5th it was down to its old faint ember above the mound, coming and going with the frost, and the winter went on, and the weather that season was as kind as any the district could remember. What that Yule left behind was nothing a person could point to. The farms came through to spring well fed and unbothered, and nobody drowned, and no boat was lost. And still the old people along both shores came out of that winter more exact than they went into it. Fires were banked just so, and courtesies were paid in full, to neighbors and to strangers off the trail, both, and when a child asked what the fuss was for, the answer given at Loibas. And probably at every hearth on that water was that exactness cost nothing, and the child who asked was generally grown old before the whole weight of the answer arrived. The light is still spoken of along that water, and by the accounts that come down, it still stands on the mound some winter nights, faint and blue, and it still brightens before weather, and the farms still read it, because it has never once been wrong. But it has never again been as bright as it was that Yule, and every teller on either shore finishes the story in the same place, in the same quiet, settled voice that Ragnhild used by the long fire at Loivaz. Whatever it was, the light stood up for. In the winter it burned brighter than it had burned in 100 years. It had not come by Ronhild's day, and it had not come by her granddaughter's day. And as far as any telling of this story can say, it has not come yet. That was the light above Helgi's mound, watched from both shores of Eyjafjord for 100 years, and trusted because it had always risen before dangerous weather. At Yule in the year 1002, it burned more brightly than anyone living had seen, so the farm secured every roof, boat, and animal, and waited through 3 mild nights beneath clear stars. The light then sank to its old faint ember, leaving the people to wonder whether its warning had been delayed rather than mistaken, and their customs were kept with particular care in every winter that followed. The next account comes from Kvammer in western Iceland, where a low green mound stood in the home field before the farm was settled, and where 4 generations turned their scythes aside until one well-meaning young worker cut its grass. The story I want to tell you now is a slow one, and it is told slowly in the place it comes from, so we will take it at its own pace and let it walk. It comes from the west of Iceland, from Borgar Fjord, a district of broad, grassy valleys running inland from a shallow bay. And from a farm called Kvamur that sits at the head of one of those valleys, where the hayland lies in a wide green bowl with a stream down the middle of it. It is the story of the mound in the home field at Kvamur, and of why the grass on that mound is never cut. And one family kept it for 4 generations before it traveled, which is the main reason it kept its shape so well. The first thing the story asks is that the country itself be understood, because the whole of it rests there. When the ships came in from Norway in the first years and the families spread up into the valleys, Iceland was empty, and it had always been empty since no people had ever lived in it, not in anyone's memory, and not before memory either. There were no paths, no names, and no old walls. The first settlers found bird cliffs and empty valleys of deep grass that had never fed a sheep, and in the whole valley, the only voices might be the stream and the ravens. And whatever a family named, they named for the first time, and whatever they built on ground that had never carried a roof. Everyone in that country in those years knew this, and it was an ordinary fact of their lives, and it matters here. Because when Onund and his wife Thor came up into that valley in Borgar Fjord and chose the ground for their hall, there was a mound already standing in the best of the grass. It was low and green, grown over with thick old grass of a deeper color than the grass around it, and it lay in the gentlest part of the field, where the hay would come best, and it had settled into the ground. Sunken a little along its middle, its edges softened into the turf, and it takes ground a long while to settle into that shape, longer than a lifetime, and everyone who ever looked at it understood that much without being told. Onund made one complete circuit on the first evening, the story says, looking at the mound from every side before he came back to the fire and said nothing. And Thor watched him do it and said nothing either. And the hall was built a respectful distance upslope, with its door facing down the valley. The rule was Thor and it was given at the first haymaking and never afterward withdrawn. The mowing was to go around the mound, and no scythe was to touch the grass on it, and that was the whole of the rule, and no reason was ever fastened to it. A child of the second generation asked her once, and the answer she gave is in the story still, and it is all the explanation the story owns. Because what Thor said was only this, that it was here first. And in that country, in those years, when everyone knew exactly what the empty land had held and what it had not, nobody at Kvamur ever asked her again. So the mowing went around, and the years went around with it. The family raised their hall in their byre, and the byre shared its long wall with the hall, and the beasts warmed the house through the winters, and the hay was the whole business of every summer. Because in that country, the winter is counted in hay, so much hay for so many beasts through the months of snow, and a farm that counts wrong in August has a long, cold spring. The wool was carded and spun through the dark months, and the loom stood against the gable wall and was seldom quiet, and the mound wore its snow in winter and its deep green in summer. And every August the scythes went down the field in their long rows, and swung out and around the mound and back again, and the curve became a custom, and the custom became simply how the field was mowed. The children of each generation were told the rule early and plainly, with no fright attached, in the same breath as the other rules of the farm, that gates are shut behind you, and that the ice on the stream is tested before crossing. And so none of them grew up afraid of the mound, and most of them grew up fond of it, because it had always been there, and it belonged to the place. The sheep grazed all around it and past it, and if anyone noticed that the sheep never once lay down on it, even on the warmest, still days, even with its grass the deepest and softest in the field, that was never made much of aloud, and it was kept in the story where such things are kept. The rule held through the lean years too, and the family told that part with the most care, because there were summers when the hay came thin, and springs when the last of it was gone from the byre before the new grass showed, and in the worst of those years the grass on the mound stood waist high, thick and dark, untouched, in plain sight of a hungry byre. A neighbor from down the valley asked, "O Nun's son straight out one autumn, why he did not cut it?" And the answer that came down inside the story is that Kva Mer gets by, and Kva Mer did get by, every year, one year with another, and the mound was never cut. The cutting, when it lasted came in the days of Haldor, Nun's great-grandson, who held the farm around the turn of the 1,000 years. It was a good hay summer, with more grass down than there were hands to work it. So Haldor hired at haytime, and among the hired was a young man called Kolbane. Come from the east fjords on the far side of the country, a long way from his own people, strong and anxious to be thought well of. He was told the rule his first morning in the plain words it was always given in, that the mowing goes around and the mound is not cut, and he heard it and nodded, and everyone went to the work. What Kolbane did, he did without any malice in it, and the story has never once been told against him. At the end of a long, good day, with the light going soft and the others gone in with their sides, he stayed out, and he stood looking at the mound with its deep grass standing waist high, the best stand in the whole field, and he had grown up in another district. Among rules that came with reasons fastened to them, and he thought, as near as anyone can come to what he thought, that here was a fine farm, wasting its finest grass on an old habit, and that a new hand to cut it clean, and even, would be seen to be worth his winter's keep. So he cut it, and it took him not much above an hour, and he did it well, close and tidy, and he raked what he had cut into a neat pile at the foot of the mound, and came in quietly in the near dark, and said nothing. Haldor saw it from the hall door at first light, the mound shorn pale among its own stubble with the cut hay piled beside it, and he stood in the doorway a long time while the household came up quietly behind him, one after another, and nobody ate much that morning. What Haldor did was remembered in the family with a certain respect, because he did not raise his voice and he did not send the young man away. He said that what was cut, and that Kolbane would handle that hay himself, all of it and nobody else, and that it would be dried and ricked apart from the rest, at the far edge of the field, and then everyone went out to the day's work, because at haytime there is always the day's work. The rest of that summer's hay cured sweet and came in dry, Because the weather held and a drying wind ran up the valley for days together, the mound hay did not cure. Colbane turned it and spread it, morning after morning, and it stayed as green and as heavy as it had been in the hour it fell, and it kept its smell, and its smell was the part every telling keeps, because it smelled of high summer, of warm, deep grass in full sun. And it went on smelling of high summer after the frosts came, and after the first snow, and no beast would put its head to it, though it stood within easy reach. And it did not rot either, and the old people minded that most of all, because hay that will not dry ought to rot, and it would do neither thing. Past Yule, in the middle of the winter dark, it was still there at the field's edge, a green rick in the snow, smelling of July, and the snow that lay thick on the hall roof and on the byre lay only thin on the rick, morning after morning, however much had come down in the night. In the first thaw, with the snow going soft and beginning to slide from the roofs in its own time, Colbane went to Haldor and asked leave, and what he asked leave to do was carry the hay back. And that is what he did, armload by armload, up the field and up the side of the mound through the better part of 2 days, and he laid it down on the cut place and spread it even. And when he had finished, he walked once around the mound and came down, and nobody watched him in any pointed manner, and nothing at all happened. That spring the grass came up through the laid hay, and by the next haytime the mound stood deeper and darker than the oldest person at Kvammer could remember it standing. And of the hay Colbane had carried up, there was no sign at all. Colbane did not leave at the season's end, and in time he married into the district and lived out his whole life at Kvammer. And the family would tell you that nobody born on that farm ever kept the rule as faithfully as the man who broke it once. And that in his old age, it was Colbane, more than anyone, who told this story by the long fire, slowly, to children who had heard it before and wanted it again. The scythes at Kvammer still swing out and around in their long, easy curve, and the curve by now is worn into the ground itself. A broad, soft path in the grass where the mowing has turned aside for 100 years, and the mound wears its snow and its deep green in their seasons, and nobody at Kvammer has ever said aloud who it is for. The story closes where it has always closed, out in the empty country before the ships, with no living soul in the whole of that land, and the mound already there in the field, low and quiet, with its grass already old. That was the mound at Kvammer, older than the first ships remembered in the district and protected by Thor Un's rule, that its grass must remain uncut. Colbane broke that rule while trying to help with the hay, yet the cut grass would neither dry nor decay, and no animal would eat it through the winter. In spring, he carried every bundle back to the mound, which had taken the hay into itself by the following season, and he remained at Kvammer for the rest of his life, guiding each later scythe around the old green rise. Now the telling moves to Gudbrandsdal in Norway, where the family's summer dairy stood high above the winter farm, beyond any road that could be crossed in deep snow, and where smoke appeared over the empty roof after Yule. Up the middle of Norway there runs a long valley called Gudbrandsdal, and a river runs the length of it called the Lågen. Broad and gray with mountain water, and the farms of that valley sit high on the sunlit side of it, because the valley floor lies in shadow for half the year. The story I have now came down that valley from a farm called Sandbu, which stood on the east side above the river, and it was old before it ever left the district, because the family told it among themselves for a generation first. Every farm of any standing in that country kept a setter in those days, which is a summer dairy, a small hut, and a milking pen up in the high pasture, half a day's climb above the valley, because the grass of the valley floor was needed for hay. And so, after midsummer, the cattle went up the mountain to graze the high grass, and part of the household went up with them and lived there through the light months, milking and churning and carrying the butter down. The Sandbu Sæter stood on a green shelf of pasture under a bare ridge, beside a stream, with birch woods below it and gray stone above it. And it was one room with a hearth in the middle and benches along the walls, and the family had gone up to it every summer for as long as they had held the farm. The old mother at Sandbu in those years was named Hild, and she had spent 50 summers at that Sæ. And when the household came down each autumn, she was the last one out the door, because the closing of the high house was hers to do, and she did it the same every year. She swept the hearth clean and laid dry birch beside it, with tinder and a fire steel in the wall niche, and she stood a new broom of bound birch twigs against the doorpost, and she left the door pegged shut, but never barred. Because the law of the high country is hospitality, and a storm-caught traveler or a late hunter must be able to get into shelter and dry wood, or the mountain would take a life that the house could have kept. And when all of that was done, she would stand a moment in the doorway and bid the house keep well until spring, and then she came down the mountain behind the cattle without looking back, because that was part of the custom too. The winter this story belongs to came in the year 1021, and it came early and hard, with snow before the autumn slaughter was finished. And by Yule, the snow stood higher than a man in the birch woods, and the path to the Sæter was not a path at all anymore, only a shape under the drifts. This wants saying plainly, so that the rest of the story can stand on it. In deep winter, nobody could go up. The climb that took half a day in summer was beyond any man's doing, and the passes over from the neighboring valleys were closed at both ends. So the high shelf under the ridge belonged to the snow. And then in the still days after Yule, when the cold was at its deepest and the air stood without moving, I, Steen, who held Sandbu then, and was Hild's son, came out at mid-morning to fodder the cattle and stopped in the middle of the yard, because far up the mountainside, small with distance, a thin gray line of smoke was rising from the shelf where the Sæter stood. It rose straight in the still air, and it went on rising all through that short day, and at dusk, when the valley turned blue, it could still be seen against the last light along the ridge. Steen was not a fearful man, and he reasoned along every road there was. He said it might be a hunter, though no hunter went to that height in midwinter, and he said it might be a man outside the law, though the passes had been shut for a month, and such a man would have needed wings. Every road he reasoned down came to the same wall, and the wall was the snow, and the snow said that no one had gone up. The younger men wanted to climb and see, and it was Åshild who said no, and she said it once, and that ended it. The high house was doing what she had left it ready to do, she said, which was sheltering someone, and whoever needed shelter at that height, in that cold, was nobody. They would be glad to walk in on. Her own grandmother had taught her that the satyr does not stand empty just because the folk come down, and that the family's part was to leave the house ready and then to leave it alone, from the last snow to the first thaw. So nobody went up. The smoke was seen again that winter, always on the stillest and bitterest mornings, and never in wind. And after the first few times, the household stopped gathering in the yard over it, because a thing seen often enough becomes part of the winter, and this became part of the winter. The ravens went over the ridge on those mornings about their own business, and the cattle were foddered, and the wool was worked. And old Åshild, when she crossed the yard on those mornings, would look up at the smoke once, and then go into her spinning. And in all that long season, nothing came down. There was no track in the home fields, and no sound at the fences in the night, because whatever kept a fire at that height, kept to that height, and it kept the rules of the house it sat in. When the thaw came at last and the path up the mountain showed itself again out of the snow, Eystein went up with his wife Ragnhild, and Åshild would not go with them, not from fear, she said, but from manners. They climbed all morning through wet snow and running water, and the shelf, when they came up onto it, was quiet, with the stream loud under its rotten ice, and the hut stood, as it had always stood, and the door was pegged shut, the same peg, set as Åshild had set it. Inside, the hut was in better order than they had left it, because the floor had been swept, and the benches were bare and clean, and the dry birch that Åshild had laid beside the hearth in the autumn lay exactly where she had laid it. Every stick of it untouched, with the tinder and the fire steel unmoved in their niche, and yet the hearth was full of ash, fine white ash, a whole winter's depth of it, banked at the edges into a careful ring. Ragnhild held her hand over the ash, and there was no warmth left in it, but there was no damp in it either, and a hearth that has stood cold under an open smoke hole from autumn to thaw is always damp. And the broom stood against the doorpost where the broom always stood, and it was the same broom Åshild had bound new in the autumn, and it was worn down to stubs. They came down and told it, and Åshild listened and nodded and was not surprised, and what she asked was only whether they had thanked the house. And Eystein said that they had stood in the doorway and said that all was found. Well, and she said that was right, and said nothing more that day. But from that autumn on, there was one thing more in the closing of the high house, because Åshild added it, and Ragnhild and her daughters kept it after her. The last one out, the door stands a new broom against the doorpost and lays dry birch beside the hearth, more than any traveler would need, and says at the threshold that the house is left ready and is welcome to whoever keeps it. And the family never again went up between the last snow and the first thaw, and nothing that kept the high house through the dark ever once came down. The smoke was not seen every winter after that. Some winters there was nothing, and the shelf stood white and bare all season, and it was noticed at Sandabu that those were the winters the family liked least, though nobody said so in words. And in the winters, when the thin gray line stood up off the mountain in the still mornings, the folk in the yard would look at it once and then go into the fire, and the lamp would be lit early on those evenings. And far up on the shelf under the ridge, the high house kept whatever it kept, in good order, with the door pegged and the hearth banked, all through the long dark. And it asked nothing of the farm below, but a broom and an armful of birch, and it never came down. That was the account from Sanbu, where the people looked up after Yule and saw smoke standing above a summer. Saw, tear, that nobody could have reached. Old Oshild would not allow anyone to climb after it, because she had closed the high house properly in autumn, and believed that whatever occupied it should be left to its winter work. When spring opened the path, the family found the hearth swept, a season's ash banked beside untouched firewood, and the new broom worn down to stubs. Every autumn afterward, they left a dry armful of birch and another broom in the shuttered house before returning to the valley. For the 8th story, we go north, to Vest, Vogue, Oy, in the Lofoten Islands, where a fishing family raised a timber from a wreck as the roof beam of their hall, and where that beam began to keep the measured stroke of oars whenever winter storms crossed the island. Off the north coast of Norway, the sea is broken by a long wall of mountain islands called Lofoten. And on one of those islands, Vest, Våg, Oi, there was a fishing farm called Berg, set above a stony cove on the seaward side, with the mountains at its back, and nothing in front of it but water. The story from Berg came along the coast in the mouths of fishermen, boat to boat and harbor to harbor. And it is a winter story, because in Lofol 10 every story worth carrying is a winter story in the end, for the plain reason that winter is when the fish come. Every year in the dark months the great cod came down out of the North Ocean into the water off those islands to spawn. And every year the men of that coast rowed out into the short gray days to take them, out before light and back after dark. Because a good winter of fishing fed a family for a year, and the fish that were not eaten fresh were split and hung on the drying racks in the sea wind until they were hard and light and would keep for years and could be traded south for whatever a farm lacked. So the sea gave that coast its whole living, and nobody on that coast ever mistook the giving for kindness, because there was not a farm that had not paid something to the water, a boat or a man, and the families that had paid the most said the least about it. Now, Luful 10 grows birch and little else, and birch is poor timber for building long, so the houses of that coast were raised out of turf and stone, with driftwood for their bones. And a straight length of good pine was worth more there than in any place where pine actually grew, which is why what came ashore in the autumn of 1027 was wealth. There had been 3 days of storm out of the northwest, and when it had blown itself out, Nund, the old fisherman who held Berg in those years, went down to the cove with his son Thorolf, and they found the shore full of a broken ship. There were strakes and broken oars and a tangle of walrus hide rigging along the curve of the beach, and in the middle of it all lay one great timber, a ridge length of close-grained pine. Sound from end to end, and of the men who had sailed her the sea had kept everyone, which was understood at Berg without being said, and not spoken of again. The law of the shore was old and plain, and it said that what the sea lays on your beach is yours, and Nund was building that year. In any case, because the hall at Berg was aging, and its roof had sagged past mending. So the great pine went up the beach on rollers with every hand on the farm pulling, and before the snow settled in, it had been shaped and set as the new roof beam of the hall, the ridge tree, with everything above the family's heads hung from it. It was the finest timber Berg had ever owned, and Nund said so with a plain conscience, because salvage was lawful, and the sea gives no explanations and expects none. The rest of the wreck was burned or worked into the farm, all but a pair of oars that had come ashore unbroken, which were hung in the boathouse because they were too good to burn, and no man at Berg ever rowed with them, though nobody said out loud why not. The first hard storm of that winter came up from the southwest at night, and the household lay on the benches and listened to the weather working at the house. A sound every coast family sleeps through, the wind at the turf and the sea loud on the stones of the cove, because a turf house in a gale talks all night and none of its talk means anything. But over their heads, the new beam was doing something different. It creaked in a rhythm, a long, slow groan, and then an ease, then the same groan and the same ease, over and over, even and unhurried, and it went on so, hour after hour, never faster and never slower. And all the while the wind came in gusts, and gusts have no count, and the beam had a count. Oh, Nund listened longer than anyone else in that house, because he had pulled an oar for 50 winters and he knew what he was hearing. And in the morning, quietly, before the others were up, he named it to his wife Ode. It was the stroke, the long, deep-water stroke of a laden crew rowing steady with far still to go. The count that settles into a man's shoulders in his first seasons and never leaves him. And the beam over his sleeping household had kept that count all night whenever the weather rose, from dark to dark. Nobody tears the roof off a sound, knew Hall over a noise in the dark, and so the family lived with it and spoke of it, little and always, plainly, and the winter went on around it. The children slept beneath the beam, and the nets were mended beneath it by lamplight, and on the storm nights the count came into the timber and rowed, and it never did anything but row. But late in the winter, Aud, who slept the lightest, said that the stroke had changed. And Nund listened through the next storm and in the morning agreed with her, because it was no longer the long, deep-water stroke. It had quickened to the short home water stroke, which is the stroke a crew takes up in the last stretch before landing, when the shore is near and the men are spending the last of what they have. And neither of them said aloud what that meant, though both had the same thought, and the thought was that the beam over their children was rowing home, and had been rowing home all winter, and was getting nearer. Nund had worked deep water his whole life, and deep water men keep one room in themselves for what the sea is, so he did not wait for that rowing to finish its crossing. On the first day of settled weather, he took Thorolf and rowed out to the winter grounds, out over the deep water that the wrecked ship must have been crossing when her luck left her. And they carried with them the pair of oars from the boathouse, the two that had hung untouched since the autumn of the wreck. Over the grounds, Nund shipped his own oars and let the boat ride on the swell, and he put the wreck's pair over the side quietly, one and then the other, and he said aloud to the water that the timber was sheltering children and was used with thanks, and that here was the rest of it given back, and that anything still owed would be paid in fish, the first fish of every catch, for as long as Berg had a boat to fish from. And then they rowed home, and he never spoke of the errand at the fire, and Aud asked him nothing, and knew. The beam went quiet that spring, and quiet is a careless word for timber, because timber in weather always talks, and the roof at Berg went on creaking in storms for 100 years after. But it creaked with the gust now, gust for gust, no evener than the wind itself, and the count did not come back into it that winter, nor the winter after. And every season from then on, the first fish of the first catch went back over the side at the grounds before any fish came into the boat. And the men of Berg taught that to their sons as plain custom, mostly without the story attached, because custom carries best when it is carried light. But the story came along the coast all the same, and the end of it is this, that once in a long while, on some deep night of some deep winter, with the sea loud on the stones, the old count would come back into the ridge tree of Berg for a few strokes, a long groan and an ease, and a long groan and an ease, and then it would soften and lose itself in the ordinary talking of the house, and the fire would settle, and nobody got up, because the first fish had been given, and Berg had always paid, and whatever was rowing out there in the dark was not rowing toward them. That was the rowing beam at Berg, a great pine timber taken from a wreck and set above the long fire, where its creaking carried an oar stroke that old Nund remembered. When the rhythm quickened to the pull of a crew nearing land, Nund and his son rowed beyond the deep grounds and returned the wreck's 2 unbroken oars to the sea, together with their thanks and the promise of the first fish from every catch. The beam settled after that offering, and although the old count sometimes returned on the deepest nights, it always softened and released the house before morning. For the last story, we return to the beginning and tell the winter at Bakki once more. More slowly now, because the fire has burned lower and the first account is already familiar. We will go back to Thor, Gills, and Oz, D's, to the sheep breathing beyond the wall and the lamp beside the open shutter, and to the patient circle that the morning snow held at its old exact distance. In the north of Iceland, there is a wide valley called Vatsdal, green and mild in its summers, and quiet under snow for the rest of the year. And in that valley stood a farm called Bakki, on its low rise near the western side. And about Bakki and the hard winter of 974, the valley kept a story that it always told twice, once quickly, for those who had never heard it, and once slowly, last thing at night, when the fire was banked and the lamp was low, because it is a story that ends in sleep either way, and this is the slow telling. The farmer at Bakki in that winter was Thor Gils, who had the land after his father, and his wife was Osdis, who had come up from the valley mouth when they married. And under their roof lived their 3 children, and a workwoman named Steinun, and an old shepherd called Grim, who had served the farm since the days of Thor Gils's grandfather. The house was a long turf house with walls, an arm span thick, one long room with the fire burning in its trench down the middle, and sleeping benches along both walls. And the byre stood against the north wall and shared it, so that the warmth and the breath of the cattle came through the turf to the benches, and the sheep were folded close against the south wall, near enough to hear on still nights, shifting and settling in the dark. And so the whole farm lay inside, one warmth, the people and the animals and the fire together, and the smoke hole above the fire was the one eye the house kept open. The winter came early that year and stayed until the eve of summer, and the snow buried the walls to the eaves, and the days shrank until the light came down the smoke hole for only a few pale hours at midday. And the household did what every household in that valley did, which was to draw in close and let the winter be the winter. Thor Gils had counted his hay twice before the frost came, and the count said the winter would be tight, but could be managed, and the wool was carded and spun by firelight. And the children slept early and woke late, and nobody at Bakki was in a hurry about anything, because midwinter in that country is not a time, it is a place, and a family lives in it until spring. And on a mid-morning after the first snow that stayed, Thor Gils went out to water the cattle and stopped part way to the byre, because the home field was written on. A single line of footprints went around the whole farm, outside the home field wall, past the byre and past the sheepfold, and behind the haystack wall, and around again to where it began. One closed ring around everything at Bakki that was warm, and the prints were the prints of bare feet, evenly spaced and unhurried, and there was no line of prints leading into the ring from anywhere, and no line of prints leading away from it. The valley was very quiet that morning, in the quiet that comes after new snow, and 2 ravens went over high up while he stood there, and then he went in and watered the cattle, and the day went on. Old Grim walked the ring with his hands behind his back, and said that his grandmother had seen the same ring at Bakki in her own day, in another hard winter, and that it had walked the whole of that winter, and had kept its distance the whole of that winter, and that the right thing to do about it was the thing they were already doing, which was nothing, done carefully. And Thor Gils, who trusted a marked stick over any man's eye, cut a birch wand to the exact distance between the wall and the near edge of the prints. And after every new snow that winter, he laid the wand down at place after place around the circle, and the wand fit, snow after snow, to the breadth of a finger. Stees made the only rule that was ever made about it, and she made it at the fire without raising her eyes from the wool in her hands. And the rule was that the thing in the field belonged to the mornings, a look and a word over it, and no more. And that the evenings belonged to the wool and to old stories that had nothing to do with Bakki, because the nights were 5 months long and the children were small, and a house winters well or badly on what it lets sit in the middle of its evenings. The farm dog, a gray, sensible bitch who had walked the sheep with Grim for 9 autumns, would not cross the home field wall after dusk that winter, and made no noise about it, and only came in when the light went and lay against the bench with her head on her paws, and the household let her be, because she was keeping the same rule they were. At Yule, in the still deep cold, Grim did the one thing anyone in that house ever did toward the ring. Because he took a bowl of the good broth out through the blue dusk and set it on the flat top of the fence stone at the gate of the home field, and in the morning the bowl was empty and clean. A fox will empty a bowl left out in that country, and a wind will tip one over, and nobody at Bakki said which it had been, and nobody stood at the door in the dark to learn. That night, or any night of that winter, because there are things it is better to do than to watch being answered, and that sentence is old Grim's, and the valley kept it as long as it kept the story. And this is the part the slow telling stays longest in, the long middle of that winter, because the family at Bakki lived all those dark months inside a warm house inside the ring, and the house stayed warm. The evenings went on in their long order. Stees' weaving growing on the loom against the gable, wool moving through Staynoon's fingers by the fire, the children asleep early in the dark end of the room. The sheep breathing on the far side of the turf, and the hay held to Thor Gils's count, and the fire was banked with care every night and blown back to life every morning, and never once went out. And on the still nights, every grown person in that room knew, without anyone saying it, that the yard beyond the wall was being written on again, slowly and evenly, by something with bare feet and all the patience in the world, and they lay in the warmth and let it be written, and slept. The quick telling goes on, from here to the thaw, and to the counting of what that hard winter cost the valley, and to the one thing everyone remembers about the counting, which is that Bakki, the farm that had wintered inside a ring nobody could explain, lost not one animal and not one soul under its roof. But the slow telling never goes so far, because the slow telling stays where the family stayed, in the deep of that winter, in the warmth, and ends there. So, it ends on an evening deep in the winter, no particular evening, because by then they were all nearly the same. With the household settled on the benches, and the fire banked and breathing under its ash, and D's trimming the little stone lamp down to the smallest steady flame that would hold. And the shutter of the small window by the door left open a hand's breadth, not for watching, because nobody at Bakki watched, but because lamplight falling on snow is a courtesy, and courtesy was what that house ran on. The light lay in a small yellow reach across the drifted yard, and out past the edge of it, the night stood the whole length of Vatsdal, patient and quiet. And the sheep were warm against the wall, and the dog lay with her head on her paws, and the children went to sleep first, and old Grim last, and the lamp burned itself slowly down toward morning. And in the morning, the ring was in the snow again, outside the wall, at the old exact distance, circling the farm as it had every morning of that winter. And the house had been warm all through the night, and it stayed warm until the eve of summer, and that is the story from Bakki, told the second time. That is where we leave Bakki for the second time, with the lamp trimmed low, the household warm, and the new snow waiting beyond the shutter. The bare footprints will be present in the morning, circling everything sheltered by the farm, and keeping the distance measured by Thorgil's birch wand, while no path will show where the walker entered the valley, or where it went before dawn. The family will tend the hearth and the animals. Old Grim's courtesy will be remembered, and the winter will continue without the boundary drawing nearer. The other tellings remain out there too. Onund at his fence in Skagafjord, the count above the smoke hole in Setesdal, the fire guarded at Holt, the blue light across Eyjafjord, the uncut mound at Kvammar, the tended Seher above Gudbrandsdal, and the rowing beam on Vest Vågøy. Each story kept its wrongness beyond a wall, a fence, a reach of firelight, or a stretch of winter sea, while the people inside carried on with the work that brought them through the dark. The stories are done for tonight, and the fire is banked for morning. The wind can remain on the far side of the turf wall. The snow can settle over the home field, and everything beyond the lamplight can keep the old distance it has kept for so many winters. Sleep well and sleep deeply, while the quiet northern weather carries on around the house.